Good morning to our participants and guests. I want to extend a warm welcome to each one of you to the South African Heritage Resource Agency's Heritage Month webinar for 2023. I am both honored and excited to gather here with you from September 18th to the 21st as we embark on our journey through our heritage story. As we gather virtually, I encourage you to actively participate in the engaging discussions and presentations that we have curated for you. Our speakers are well-renowned in their respective fields and will offer great insights into conservation management in South Africa. I extend my deepest gratitude to our partners and the entire SARA team who have worked tirelessly to make this webinar a reality. Your dedication and support have been instrumental in bringing us together on this virtual platform. Thank you for being a part of this remarkable journey, and let's make these 4 days an unforgettable chapter in the ongoing narrative of South Africa's heritage. I'll now be handing over to our program director, Ms. Kim Ngobeni, who is based in our Pretoria office. Thank you.
Today we are dealing with development. So when you enter can you just mute yourself? That your camera is on. And we will be starting with the first speaker. Application Unit. Ms. Natasha, the University of Pretoria in 2010. She worked as an intern at the Albany Museum in Grahamstown for just over a year and as an assistant South African Heritage Resources Agency in 2017. Development applications and all men.
Just give me 1 second. Perfect. Good morning and welcome. My name is Natasha Higgett, and I am the manager of the newly established Development Applications Unit. This presentation serves to introduce the audience to this new unit, our mandate, roles, and responsibilities, as well as some future projects of the unit. All right. The DAU was established as part of a recent restructuring at SARA. The unit forms part of the larger Heritage Conservation Management Division. And the unit was established to remove the function of processing development applications from the specialist units, so that these units could focus on the requirements of their own specialized fields and to provide the development applications function with more capacity as well as consistency. As the name implies, the main role of the unit is to process development applications in terms of Section 38 of the National Heritage Resources Act. And these include various permits that may be required to mitigate heritage resources impacted by developments. Together with the SARA Heritage Protection Unit, we conduct compliance monitoring visits, including complaints levied by the public whenever a development damages or destroys the heritage resource. Of course, policy development and the drafting of regulations are a crucial part of our unit's activities, which I will discuss later on. As in the spirit of our Act, we cannot work in silos, and we must consult with our stakeholders in order to improve not only the Section 38 process, but our consulting industry as a whole. We aim not only to attend conferences and workshops, but to host them as well in future, where we can bring industry role players together with consultants so we can work together and grow our industry. So SARA has jurisdiction for development applications, obviously within our national heritage sites, developments below the high water mark, and those in provinces without fully competent provincial heritage resource authorities. These include the Northwest, Northern Cape, Gauteng, Limpopo, Mpumalanga, and the Free State. So SARA provides comments and decisions required as part of Section 38 in those 6 provinces, as well as any national site within the 3 provinces with fully competent PRAs. The 3 competent PRAs are Heritage Western Cape, Eastern Cape Provincial Heritage Resources Authority, and the Institute, previously known as AMAFA in KZN. SARA does not process development applications in those provinces, unless, of course, within a national site. As a result, SARA processes on average 1,000 development applications a year. And with the increase in development in South Africa, that number rises every year. An interesting area of overlap are national heritage sites that are also World Heritage Sites. Now, while national heritage sites are obviously under the jurisdiction of SARA, World Heritage Sites are managed by the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment in terms of the National Environmental Management Protected Areas Act, or NEMPA. Here we have a list of some of our national and also provincial heritage sites that are also World Heritage Sites, that include Robben Island, Game Pass Shelter, and Mapungubwe, which is also a national park. These overlapping areas of jurisdiction add a layer or another level of completion process, can be very complex and possibly boring for people who are not interested, but I will try to summarize it briefly. So what are development applications? Developments that we see in our applications include renewable energy development projects. These include your wind farms, your solar farms, even hydroelectric power stations, mining and prospecting rights, new roads, pipelines, either water, residential areas, but to name a few. All of these developments are crucial components in building South Africa's economy and our country as a whole, while providing much needed jobs and services to South African citizens. Our development application process is split into 2 separate processes. One for the larger developments, which are your wind farms and your mines. These form parts of the environmental authorization process in terms of the National Environmental Management Act, or NEMA. Here, the heritage component is part of a larger environmental impact assessment process. And heritage resource authorities provide comments that the Department of Forestry, Fishery and the Environment, or Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, will take into account when they make the decision on the development. The other process is for much smaller development applications where they do not require an environmental authorization. Here, the Heritage Resources Authority makes the decision whether the development may occur based on a standalone HIA. For this process to occur, appropriately qualified and experienced heritage consultants are appointed by a developer or an environmental assessment practitioner. to complete a heritage impact assessment. And these may include some specialist studies, including a paleontological assessment or an underwater heritage component. These reports, along with supporting documents, are submitted to SARA for review, and we either support or object to a development based on the impact to the heritage resources. Now, as part of the HIA, heritage resources that have been identified may require mitigation if they are to be impacted. This includes the collection of artifacts, detailed recordings or excavations, or relocation. Each permit has a separate process and specific requirements that need to be completed. Currently, permits as part of the environmental authorization development application process are only issued once the development is authorized. Here we need to know that the development has been authorized and has been given the go-ahead and will actually occur, and that the impacts to the heritage resources are going to happen. Then we can issue those permits. With a smaller application process, we can issue permits at the same time as the decision. It must be highlighted that each permit has a permit fee, and those differ based on the type of permit. It must also be noted that since January of this year, 2023, we have been charging application fees for development applications. We never used to charge these before, but we do charge for them now. And SARA will not process any application if no proof of payment is provided. Now, we recognize that mitigation permits are very different to research permits, where researchers can spend years excavating and investigating sites, while mitigation must be done quickly to allow development to be constructed. But that does not mean that we do not learn from the mitigation. As noted on Monday by PGS in their presentation, a development application or mitigation as part of development often serves as a means to gather more information than traditional research ever could. With the majority of our HIAs, it will often be the first time that a heritage resource is identified and the very last time that we can gather information about it. Over 60% of the heritage sites that are in our database have been identified as part of the HIA process. So obviously some permits require consultation with communities, and agreements must be drafted regarding heritage, such as with graves. This is in keeping with the spirit of our Act, being an inclusive legislation process where South Africans can take part in the management and protection of their own heritage. And to ensure that heritage resources are mitigated appropriately, only qualified and experienced individuals who have specific training may undertake mitigation. I'm going to briefly run through a few of our permits that we process in the DAU. Obviously, our national and provincial, and we wish to keep these as intact and undeveloped as possible. However, some development may become necessary, such as a wastewater treatment plant on Robben Island, or a new power line at Tawung National Heritage Site to provide electricity to the new on-site museum facility. Some national heritage sites should be treated as no-go areas and should be seen as fatal flaws to developments, as mitigating impacts to these sites can be quite extensive. For our Section 34 sites, these are our structures older than 60. SARA does not process these permits. This function lies with all provincial heritage resource authorities. SARA processes, or the DAU processes, mitigation permits for archaeological and paleontological sites and meteorites for the 6 provinces without fully competent PRAs. If any APM site requires mitigation, the permit is submitted to the DAU for processing. The DAU also processes mitigation permits for our maritime, coastal infrastructure, aircraft wreck sites, and sites within our inland lakes, rivers, and dams. Lake Fundutsi, for example, in Limpopo, is a National Heritage Site, a 7-kilometer protected buffer, and the DAU would process any mitigation permit within its boundaries. The final permit that the DAU processes is for grave relocation. Graves older than 60 years, located outside of a formal cemetery, ancestral graves, royal graves, and graves of traditional leaders, as well as specifically designated graves, are protected by our Act, and any impacts to these sites must be mitigated. First, a consultation process is undertaken to identify the next of kin, or those with a traditional interest in the graves. The next of kin, or interested parties, decide on the future of those graves. Some may request that the graves remain in place, and then therefore must be conserved and managed. If grave relocation is agreed to, then the permit may be applied for. And again, permits are only issued to archaeologists who have the skills to exhume graves with the care and respect that they deserve. Graves are sensitive and form part of many customs and beliefs, and the relocation of graves must always be a last resort. Graves should be considered as fatal flaws for developments, and impacts are to be avoided as far as possible. My colleague Madida will discuss some of the complex issues that arise from grave relocations in South Africa later on today, solve some of these challenges. As noted of these challenges. As noted earlier, the DAU conducts compliance monitoring and site inspections where heritage resources may be at risk or have been damaged or destroyed. We have heritage inspectors who are empowered to confiscate equipment, material, and even arrest individuals if an offense has occurred. False representation or fails to comply with the conditions of permits or approvals of a heritage resource authority. SARA Processing System, or SARS. My colleagues on Thursday will be chatting about the soon-to-be-released SARS 2.0, which includes an update to the user interface as well as providing a better workflow. SARS is an open and free-to-use platform where all development documents are uploaded and can be viewed by our case officers, but can also be used for the public to scrutinize any development application across South Africa, should they have an interest. Students may also use some of the thousands of HIAs at a more landscape level. SARS also allows for greater transparency regarding the comments and decisions of a heritage resource authority. Every comment and decision, or on a mitigation permit, is accessible to the public, so that the public can also play a part in the management of him. Now, as a new unit, we are still finding our feet and filling vacant positions. However, there are some projects that we have already joined and projects that we will be embarking on in future. We were involved as part of the first phase of the Energy One-Stop Shop, which has since been launched. SARA is working with other national government departments to form a more integrated approach to development applications across South Africa and to provide a better application flow. As part of the identified, SARA was part of the first phase of the Square Kilometre Array project, as well as the first initial phase of the Renewable Energy Development Zones. And we will continue to be part of the strategic environmental assessment for the next phases of these renewable energy development zones across South Africa. SARA as a spatial development framework, where various projects are being undertaken to understand the best way forward to realize the goal of a development of a smart city within the Eastern Cape and KZN province. The DAU also sits on Working Group 5 forum, where legislation pertaining to the NEMA environmental authorization process is discussed, and we will soon be joining the Marine Spatial Planning Forum regarding all developments in our marine environment. As part of our future projects, regulations are high on our priority list. While actually a current project, regulations for Section 38 of the National Heritage Resources Act will be circulated to the public for public comment, hopefully within the next year. These regulations will provide additional guidance on the overall process and how it should be followed. Now, the DAU again recognizes the guidance regarding the process to be followed, including a specific section for grave relocation permits. Additionally, the DAU will investigate and propose PASA. These regulations will, of course, be drafted in consultation with our stakeholders, including various heritage associations. We will also be drafting a policy regarding offshore developments and the impact to heritage resources that does not just include shipwrecks, but all heritage that can be found in institutions, to ensure that the required skills and knowledge that the industry needs is being taught. Being a heritage consultant is more than just walking across the country and finding heritage. It is also understanding how to assess the significance of heritage, how it will be impacted, applying one's mind and workable mitigation measures, but also having an understanding of law, business, stakeholder engagement, client management, marketing, even knowing how to drive a 4x4 are skills that an individual will need to flourish as a heritage consultant. Finally, and this may be an ambitious project, but I would like to compile a guideline or a handbook to heritage impact assessments in South Africa. I envision this being used almost as a textbook in tertiary education and for anyone wanting to learn about our sector. Once the regulations have been finalized, I will put out a call for contributions for chapters and case studies from the industry. The DAU seeks not only to issue regulations, provide more red tape, ensure compliance with our legislation, but also to grow the industry into a professional body that works together for the good of heritage in South Africa and to improve the lives of South Africans overall. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Colleagues, we from Paul and
for that development. How you assess one of the permit applications you is being applied for. In those cases where you might be required to say travel and incur travel costs or say, is there any limited resources to undertake all activities or assessment or kind of filter them through to the third party who is actually making the question.
Thank you, Paul, for that. With regards to or is able to intervene. So, Natasha, over to
Right, so Paul, with regards to your question, the majority of applications that we process that would be incurred, if there are site inspections that need to be undertaken, and there, Section 35(5) of our National Heritage Resources Act kicks in. This is a CEIS-Works order process where SARA may invoice the offending party to reimburse for the costs of that investigation. So there is that allowance. Raz, with regards to your question, yes, we often get applications that are incomplete and are of bad quality. And that is the main reason why Section 38 regulations are being drafted, to ensure that when we do receive reports like that we have a process to follow, as in immediate rejection of those reports, as well as with the registration of heritage practitioners, because there's no real consequences for heritage practitioners who submit bad reports. And as part of that registration process, there will be disciplinary procedures as part of that registration. So this is something we're definitely doing right now. That handbook, guidebook will be done once our regulations have been drafted, as a more user-friendly way of explaining the process instead of legalese, which not everyone may fully understand. For the last question, yes, graves are always a difficult, grave relocations are always a difficult process. With your question regarding how the next of kin is determined, that will be part of our regulations that we're going to be drafting. And this will be done in consultation with the industry as well as other government departments, so that we can understand how the next of kin should be determined. With regards, again, as Kim noted, that there is a presentation on wake fees later on today. But again, as part of these regulations and the discussion regarding grave relocations that we will be embarking on in future, this will be a topic that we will discuss. How we will address this, I cannot say how right now. We will need to have those discussions to understand the whole situation and challenge as a whole before we can move on to address those challenges. I do hope that I've answered all the questions. Thank you very much for the questions. And my email is always available for anyone who wishes to send me.
Always available to assist. And as we have noted, it's a new unit. There are things that we are looking into, things that we to improve on, work on. So we are it has already been formed, so it would be much better gaps that we as SARA need to fix on. So colleagues, hence we are having these seminars to engage and for your engagements. I'm sure SARA team that from Mr. Lee, who will be also studied heritage studies. To you, Ms. Trump, and we are ready for.
Thank you, Ms. Ngobeni. Thank you. Good morning, colleagues. I'm still trying to share the slides. Thank you.
It's visible. Yes, it's visible.
It's visible. Oh,
yes.
Thank you. The Repatriation and Restitution Office, in fact, we always make mistakes to start with restitution. It is, in fact, the Repatriation and Restitution Office. So mine is to introduce the RRO and the Repatriation and Restitution Program. Firstly, this came about due to the National Policy on Repatriation and Restitution of Human Remains and Heritage Objects that was approved by the Cabinet in March 2021. Subsequently, a Ministerial Advisory Committee on Human Remains and Heritage Objects was established, and it invited heritage institutions and government departments, which were Department of Military Veterans and the Missing Persons Task Team that resides within the Department of Justice. They convened a workshop in August 2023, whereby an implementation plan was developed. It also, I'm struggling with technology. I'm trying to call up Sledge. Oh, okay. I think I've won. Thank you. Sorry. Okay. The as I did indicate, further to that, a repatriation and restitution program framework was developed and endorsed by the Cabinet in March 2023. An implementation plan for repatriation of remains of persons associated with the liberation struggle that died in exile in identified African countries was also developed. And then the recommendation was also made that the Repatriation and Restitution Office should be established within SARA to coordinate and implement the Repatriation and Restitution Program. As I did indicate, this program that RRO coordinates is a interinstitutional program whereby various institutions have to implement their respective mandates within the program. Moving forward, the framework that was established, I hope this is visible. Firstly, it came out with various priorities that come from the national policy, of which I would share with colleagues so that you acquaint yourselves with the contents and also see where there are challenges and shortfalls within the policy. The main priority that is identified within this framework is the repatriation and restitution of human remains of South Africans, that is liberation heroes and heroines who died in exile in identified countries. That's the first priority, which is still within living memory and of which there are families and other stakeholders that are pushing for this repatriation. The second priority would be the restitution of human remains of South Africans and apartheid resistance and liberation heroes and heroines who died in various locations within the country between 1960 and 1994. That covers, for instance, people that died in confrontation with security forces. I would expand on that moving forward. The third, or let me say the second, linked to this second priority would be the restitution of human remains of South African resistance and liberation heroes and heroines who died in various locations within the country. There will be anti-colonial resistance and campaigns up to 1910, which include passive resistance and defiance campaigns that took place up to 1960. Up to March 1960, when the liberation movements were banned, and then which then introduced the liberation struggle period. And priority 3A would be the undertake restitution of human remains from local museums, academic institutions, and other research private institutions that may have repositories of human remains, which would imply that they would need to deaccession them. And then we move to priority 3B, undertake restitution of heritage objects from local museums, academic institutions, and other research private institutions that may have repositories of, sorry, it's not clear, much clear on my side. Can I just maximize it? Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Then it's much clearer. I was at priority 3A, undertake restitution of human remains from local museum, academic institutions, and other research private institutions of human remains. I think I've covered that. And then 3B would be undertake restitution of heritage objects from local academic institutions and other research private institutions that may have repositories of human remains. I think there is a typo there. Yeah, there is a typo there. I would need to correct that. It should read as human remains from institutions outside the country. And then priority 4A relates to sorry, there's some confusion, but so repatriation of and restitution of human remains of South African from or to museums, academic and research institutions in identified countries. Why is that? It's because there are some human remains that come from other countries within South Africa that need to be sent back to the countries of origin. And then repatriation and restitution of South African heritage objects, including artworks from museum, academic institutions, and research institutions in identified countries. That also should be a reciprocal program, because our museums also do hold such heritage artifacts and documents from other countries. I would expand to that also. And then moving to priority 1, which is repatriation of human remains of South African and liberation heroes and heroines who died in exile in identified countries. The workshop that met in August 2022 sort of developed or focused more on this priority and developed a more detailed implementation plan. And then within the policy objectives that were extracted from the policy would be to ensure that exhumation processes in cases of restitution, repatriation of human remains from foreign countries are coordinated in a regulated manner within the framework of service providers' mandate and relevant legislation. Ensure that the dignity of human remains is preserved throughout the repatriation process using international best practice guidelines. Ensure that communities and families involved are interacted with throughout the repatriation and restitution process. Furthermore, it will ensure that restitution and repatriation, including identification and actual exhumation, is conducted in accordance with international best practices and all relevant legislation, which might be the NHRA and applicable legislation within the hosting countries where those remains are, and international protocols that govern such actions, and first and foremost being the Geneva Convention of 1949 that governs as to how the human remains of fallen military veterans should be treated. The legislative provision for this priority of repatriation of remains of the fallen liberation struggle combatants and civilians that died in exile is in accordance with Section 36.9 of the NARA, which reads that SARA must assist other state departments in identifying graves in a foreign country of victims of conflict, with the liberation struggle, and following negotiations with a next of kin and relevant authorities, it may reinter the remains of that person in a prominent place in the capital of the Republic. Much as we don't have a hero's acre with a space for burials, this is indicative that such remains should be buried in a respectable area within different parts of the country. And as we do know that some municipalities have heroes acres, another legislative provision, as alluded to, is the Military Veterans Act number 18 of 2011, which also protects the graves and memorials associated with military veterans of statutory and non-statutory forces. Done by families, done by provincial governments, done by municipalities, and they were actually not coordinated, and a lot did happen in those countries because there was no confirmation of graves prior to exhumation and reburial. There were no, like, for instance, DNA confirmations. They would go and then rely on headstones that were there, or rather the memories of people that attended the burials decades ago, which in most cases were not accurate. So there's been instances where there was a mix-up of remains due to that ad hoc repatriations. So a new repatriation model that has been established, which we are implementing as the RRO. First and foremost, there's a database of those buried in each country. Consultation with affected families regarding their wish for repatriation. Families are prominent in all these issues. Primarily burial site verification, whereby those buried in that country or section of the country, there is a detailed verification of those graves, whose graves are they, and also using cemetery registers, and also using death registers within the respective countries to identify such graves. Forensic teams conduct exhumations in each country, and the remains are boxed and flown back to South Africa through the SANDF plane. That's what we envisage to do as we're about to embark with the first phase of exhumations. The remains are conclusively identified in South Africa, either on the basis of the burial records combined with biological profile of the remains. That would be age and sex, and looking at this, skeletal analysis of the remains. The DNA, if the burial records or burial circumstances are inadequate, there would always be a DNA sample that is collected from relatives of, also surviving relatives of that are claiming, or let me rather say that have requested that the remains be repatriated. Okay, I would skip that. This is an example of the graves in Tanzania, where South Africans are buried due to a lack of constant maintenance. You'd find that graves are not clearly identifiable, they are overgrown. Okay, this is an intervention that we've done previously. These are graves in Kinondoni in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. These are graves in a camp, the ANC camp in Dakawa. The burials date from 1985 to about 1993. And there's about 50 in this camp. The previous campsite, or the graves in another campsite, there's about, I think, 72 graves in Morogoro, in Mazimbu, Somafco, Soman Freedom College. And when the space ran out, these were additional graves from 1985. I think from the Somafco graves date from 1979. So it's just to indicate how many deaths took place in exile. These are some examples of countries and number of graves in each country. These are just African countries, and there are graves also in Europe, few countries in Europe, and Cuba, and the USA. Okay. Priority to restitution of human remains of South Africans, anti-apartheid resistance and liberation heroes who died in various locations within the country 1960 to 1994. This covers mainly people that disappeared, political prisoners that died in detention, judiciary and extrajudiciary executions, judiciary being those that were hanged, extrajudiciary executions that were those that were killed and were buried secretly, and whose graves and remains are unknown to the families. These are covered under Section 36.7A, which reads thus: SARA must, over a period of 5 years from the date of the commencement of this Act, submit to the Minister for his or her approval lists of graves and burial grounds of persons connected to the liberation struggle and who died in exile or as a result of the action of the state, security forces or agents, profiteers, and which after a process of public consultations, it believes should be included among those protected under this section. For this purpose, the RRO works closely with the Missing Persons Task Team, the Truth and Reconciliation Unit, which both are within the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development, and they are tasked with searching for graves of people that died between 1960 and 1994, which was, whose names were submitted to the TRC and were secretly buried. Among those would be, for instance, the Mamelodi 10. We are partnering on that. Benson Mampe, it's one example of a person that died in detention in 1963 and was buried as a pauper. And due to a lack of records in the cemetery, his grave is unknown, and there was a symbolic burial conducted by the family on the 31st of August at the prison in Worcester. And then another example is the grave of Mr. Timothy Ntati, who died in detention in Pollsmoor prison, or in the hospital section of Pollsmoor in 1969. 3 graves of Namibians, as we do know that Namibia was being colonized by South Africa up to 1990 or 91. So activists of SWAPO were sent to Robben Island, and some died in detention. So there's 3 graves left in South Africa at Maitland Cemetery. There's 2 in Maitland Cemetery and 1 in Gugulethu. So those are some of the cases that we are currently working on. Priority 2B, restitution of human remains of South Africans who died in various locations within the country, anti-colonial wars and campaigns up to 1910, inclusive of passive resistance and defiance campaigns up to 1960. So those mainly are graves of leaders of colonial resistance campaigns that might have died in detention or in battle, whose graves are known or under threat from natural forces. To cite one example, which we're currently working on, is the grave of Nkosi Stokwe of, I've forgotten what his clan is called, but it's at Itala. It's located next to the river. And so there's a need to really establish whether those remains are his, or to actually locate the grave where it's is suspected to be located. So that's the current project. And another that is in the pipeline also would be an archaeological excavation of the grave of Kumkani Insa of Amakosa, that is located next to a river, and it's usually threatened by flooding due to its location where because it's located where next to a river bend. I've forgotten what the geographical term is, where the river takes a turn. Okay. And then Project 3A undertake a restitution of human remains from local museums, academic institutions, and other research private institutions that may have repositories of human remains.
We have 5 minutes remaining.
I started late, ma'am.
Yes.
Okay, so 5. Okay, thanks. I'll be done in 5. Thank you. Okay, there's no specific reference to human remains that are in museums or academic or research institutions. Such remains were unethically collected for scientific studies from graves. And for science laboratories, it might be unclaimed bodies in government mortuaries, and also voluntary donations from individuals or families who might have donated such remains. One example of remains that would be restituted to back where they come from, there is 54 remains within Iziko Museum that they intend to repatriate to Colesberg. In the past 2 weeks back, there was a colloquium on human remains at UCT and discussing such issues. So there's also a need to discuss them further as to how this would happen. And there isn't a detailed implementation plan or an intervention plan or guidelines within the policy. So that is still in the process of being developed as to how we're going to go about with regard to those restitution of remains to areas where they come from. Related to that as well, but it's remains that are held by South-African human remains that are held by museums abroad. Hunter Museum at the University of Glasgow has volunteered to return 10 sun skulls, which is within their collections. The Smithsonian Institution in Washington, in the USA, has 5 skulls from Port Alfred, and it's of convicts. There was an exchange with the Albany Museum around 1910, and Albany Museum received about 15 Peruvian heads from the Smithsonian Institution. And lastly, heritage objects. Australian museums have volunteered to return Zulu cultural weapons, and the Shulubane family from Limpopo is claiming their sacred family artifacts from Newcastle Museum in Switzerland. That's one example whereby missionaries were instrumental in assisting anthropologists or whoever that were collecting artifacts from South Africa for repository in museums in those respective countries. So that's one example. And then another example which indicates that in South Africa also we have artifacts that come from other countries. At the KZN Museum, there are Ghanaian artifacts that are there. I think there is a stool and other artifacts that come from the Asante in Ghana. And then Eswatini is also claiming some collections that are held at McGregor Museum that were collected in 1960s from Swaziland. So there's a detailed inventory for those. Yeah, this is where I end. Thank you, Program Director, and thank you, colleagues, for your time.
Wow, thank you for that presentation, Mr. Troy. I think it's very enlightening, informative, and dealing with your unit, I'm sure there's so much to do. There's so much work that needs to be done. There's so much research that you put in. There's so much consultations that go through regarding the unit, because I'm sure it's not easy. You're dealing with communities. Some families are angry. Some families feel abandoned. And once again, thank you for questions. To raise your hand, put it in the chat. Any hands, but some comments. Wait. John. Okay, please
Director.
go ahead.
Action would be to deactivate from the in coffins or bank covered indicated them to be reburied in by scientists.
As much as we're dealing with tangible heritage, is the RRO planning to undertake projects around the world, or is it on a volunteer premise?
Is a program that in within South Africa to countries. Following countries would be encouraged to identify origin and then yet such and even with cases of voluntary repatriations, before we deal with those museums, we inform only interested, but that belong to South Africa within its we don't have national museums that the museums operate at laws, the international from those institutions to avoid the they treat and some are really pushing to avoid such. They are really pushing to heritage objects. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad. I can hear you for 2 hours of heritage. A heritage practitioner, we're calling in heritage. But thank come to the new colleagues, manager of the and Restitution Office, and from Ms. Nat, explaining the mandate of the deployment. Wasting any time, we're speaker, which will be addressing community development. Mr. Kobane Siboyo, heritage resource management and protection of the national as community culture and heritage, and in particular the role that this can play in realizing a more equitable and representative heritage landscape. Obani, our architect.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to basically say a warm welcome to the third day, I think, of this heritage webinar. Basically, what I'll be doing is more of a conversational presentation around the issues around heritage development and community. However, I'd like to firstly welcome to this discussion a heritage practitioner. Her name is Juanita Sami, and Juanita basically has been involved within WOCAP and also the declaration of WOCAP over a number of years. And she is the owner of a heritage consultancy called Vida Memoria, where she consults on heritage resource management, focusing on protection, preservation, and promotion of heritage. I will go further into introducing her in terms of the conversation during this talk. Right now, I'd just like to share the presentation and then to locate us as to what area and context that we're going to be working in. Okay. So heritage community in the development of Bo-Kaap. So the Bo-Kaap basically is a community whereby it's abutted by Table Mountain within the City Bowl and Lion's Head. And within that, it's within the city grid. Most people know this picture quite well because it's famous both here and abroad. And for our audiences that aren't from South Africa or Cape Town, this is basically Bo-Kaap situated in the bottom of the tip of Africa, which is Cape Town and in the peninsula. It's a hybrid community of culture, heritage, and also a community which has formed a great part of the history of Cape Town. First of all, Juanita, if I can go to you, how did you become a heritage practitioner, and how in your interest in terms of heritage and community, where do those begin? Please explain.
Thanks, Kabani, and hi to everybody. I attended a talk recently where a colleague of mine introduced herself, and she's an environmental practitioner. And she started off by saying that she's from the Bo-Kaap. So she located herself as she's from the Bo-Kaap. And she came up to me afterwards and she said, it's very important when you talk to audiences that don't know why you've chosen a particular path to explain. So I don't think I've ever shared this, but I think it's common knowledge that I'm from the Bo-Kaap. So that kind of has a big role to play in why I got into heritage. But also my dad's family were forcibly removed from District 6.
Okay.
So our family's linked to Cape Town and changes within Cape Town and forced removals is very, very strong. And there's no way you can grow up without that impacting you and impacting your choices. So I always say, not always say, but I've said quite often that some kids go to bed hearing bedtime stories. We go to bed listening to stories about forced removals. Okay. So I think heritage is a very natural progression from town planning to wanting to do more community-based work and looking at significance.
Okay.
I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. Thank you. No, that's a very good overview. In terms of where we are as heritage practitioners, because most people just think this heritage thing usually just happens, right? But there is, as you say, there's either an epiphany or a moment whereby your interests align with your history and also where you're located in terms of context. Now, my interrogation or question to you is that in terms of then veering towards why this particular place is important, not only to the community of Cape Town, not South Africa, but broader, could you please kind of trace those out in terms of its importance to you? Because you studied it, you've spent your professional life doing it, you're still occupied in making this place a place of great significance and also recognition around the world and also here. So if you could briefly just touch on that, because most people don't know. Thank you.
So, I mean, just in terms of the significance of Bo-Kaap and what it means to me, again, I'll just say from a personal point of view, I think growing up under apartheid in the Bo-Kaap was a very different experience to what I've had people my age now telling me their experiences growing up on the Cape Flat. So we were quite isolated. But there was a heavy military police presence. But we were, it was an environment where people could practice their religion. And we discussed this earlier. It's not a fact that's spoken about often, but the Bo-Kaap essentially became a Muslim area under apartheid.
Yeah.
And that's a narrative that I think is very, very interesting, and that ties into the significance of Bo-Kaap, because Bo-Kaap has these various layers that make it significant. So it does have these very strong links to the growth in the spread of Islam at the Cape. So we're talking 300 years ago, but it also has a very dark history in terms of what it represented in terms of during the apartheid era. So the same year that people were being removed, forcibly removed from District 6, people were being forcibly removed from the Bo-Kaap if they were not so-called Malay, if they didn't look a certain way and they were not Muslim. So my interest in the Bo-Kaap is these various layers that make up this particular area and the narrative, the dominant narrative that has now come out, that the significance is only tied to religion, which it's not.
So the emphasis is, if I can hear you correctly, is about the idea that it's a hybrid community, which is made up of many cultures, but over time, whether it was by state action in the form of apartheid and or forced removals, it was, for example, the example you made earlier that we discussed was, for example, most people wouldn't know that my grandmother lived in the Bo-Kaap, where other people, it was a community whereby both slaves and also people of color also had the edge of the city, because over the 300-year history, that was seen as the edge of the city and it was a hybrid community. So the stories that exist have a certain thinking about it now, you would actually say that there's a certain urgency and urgent nature in terms of how do you recover and also inform in terms of the people that are living today, because generationally, that story is slowly going away because people are not remembering as well as before. So now going into that, I'll look at the legislative framework. And what we're talking about, for example, is this is a map by the City of Cape Town, which looks at the various types of heritage within the city limits. And basically broke up the more defined map is a hybrid of both built heritage, cultural significance, and so on. So over the last couple of years, especially since the promulgation of the National Heritage Resource, about acknowledging and also preserving of heritage within this community.
I know we probably don't want to go all the way back but I think it was 1983 when the City of Cape Town first suggested an urban conservation area for the Bo-Kaap. And I think there was a state, the local community, for the most part, said we don't want further legislation. We don't want another layer of government telling us, well, tell me I own my home, but you're going to tell me now what I can do and can't do.
Okay.
So the shift to the HPOZ and the Declaration of Heritage Sites was post-94.
Yeah.
And this area now doesn't have that designation as a Malay area.
Yeah.
So gentrification is starting.
Yeah.
And I think the misconception that heritage protection and the HPOZ is going to stop vacation may have fueled these types of initiatives to say, please, what layer of protection can we have to conserve our area? And the conservation and the protection is then linked to the religious aspect.
Okay. So that everyone's aware, basically the municipal bylaws and also laws adhering to city planning were a city level. And then you also had provincial legislation that also talked about protection of the area as a heritage area. So the HPOZ was an amalgamation of both dealing with the challenges within that area that it faced, whether it be developmental issues or challenges with innovation of a particular character within the streetscape of the area at the time, using legislation. However, what became the instrument of doing that was the Heritage Protection Overlay Zone, but also what happened was there was an issue within law whereby public participation became important. And I'd like you to kind of explain to people how, in terms of public participation, because how do you then let communities know? Because not everyone is au fait with what these laws mean, how do they impact their daily lives and so forth. And how did that process bring you to where you are today, where we have some heritage sites that are proclaimed within the area? Because that must have not been an easy process.
No. So just in terms of consultation, in terms of city bylaws, I can't speak to what the City of Cape Town does. I do think that there's failures in terms of getting information to local communities. I don't think the traditional way of calling a meeting at the civic center at 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening is the way to disseminate information. One of the things we discussed earlier was that there's a complete lack of information and awareness around what these processes of heritage are. So I don't want to start saying what is heritage, but heritage is a process. I think there's even a lack of understanding that heritage in terms of the National Heritage Resources Act is a process. And so consultation, just from a purely process perspective, consultation is a requirement of whether it be a heritage impact assessment or Section 34 application, which is changes to a building over 60 years. Consultation becomes a requirement. And what is quite sad to note is that people do the minimum requirements. You know, did we put an ad in the paper? Did we put a poster on site? So I think there's consultation and then there's meaningful engagement. And I don't think that our processes are at the point where we can confidently say that they encourage meaningful engagement. Unfortunately, that's the reality of being in practice and running projects. And so, I mean, there are certain things that we do, especially when we work in sensitive areas like the World Cup, where we do more than what is legislatively required. In terms of the declaration of heritage sites in the World Cup, it was SARA, in fact, that identified the World Cup as a potential grade 1 site in the early 2000s. And it's interesting that you tie these two topics together, because where the process got halted, where the process ran into really difficult territory, was the consultation. So it was, you know, the changeover from where we were politically, and there's still this distrust of the state, and you are going into an area to say, this is, you know, this is now, instead of having this urban conservation area that we thought that would have certain guidelines and bylaws, it's now a national initiative to declare this area as a national heritage site. So the shift had to happen from declaring the entire area to declaring sites. So you're looking at early 2000s to the sites only being declared in 2019. And I think it's just been a learning curve for all parties involved, for SARA, for the community, for us as practitioners, in how to navigate these processes. Because obviously, the consultation, if you look at, I don't know if you want to talk about other nominations, but consultation becomes the most important factor. So writing up the dossiers, submitting the dossiers, and then that period where you do the consultation is where you really have to engage in order to get to the declaration of results.
So thank you very much for articulating that in the importance of how we got to where we are today. And the one thing which you clearly identify is that it's not a static resources they have within their midst. The state to know when to intervene, and also how the state then becomes more agile in being able to take into account the needs of the community. And this is why the BOCOP is an interesting case whereby community, state, and state intervention, as well as development, are all happening within a time scale and imperatives of how cities are. That's why it makes BOCOP very interesting in how it has developed as a place. Now, the declaration says the community spirit of the BOCOP is described in historical studies has been carried through the last 2 centuries by generations residing in the area, and the protection of religious, cultural, and architectural heritage in the area with the line of the statement of significance of the 2019 declaration. I'm not going to read the whole thing because that we can basically flag later. But what the main thing was that was understood is that for purpose of declaration, the historical value, the aesthetic value, the scientific value, the social value, the spiritual value, the rarity and living history were the main focuses of this declaration, which is still ongoing. What most people recognize, and I'd like you to cast your eye on this picture, is that from the first picture of the presentation, we looked at Bo-Kaap, and it's this beautiful place, and also it's got a particular character that people see today. However, due to the history, if you look at the center image, was that during the 60s and 70s, there was a huge drive by the state to make the Bo-Kaap what it is today in terms of the buildings and the laws that were promulgated and so forth. Now, the one thing that is always interesting is within this area, there are other pushes and also challenges that it faces. Can you articulate in today's terms, because this is where it was, and this is around when forced removals were taking part, and the type of community it is now versus the type of community it was then?
So, right, so it's a highly contentious issue.
Right.
But I think it's not commonly spoken about. It's not openly spoken about that the Bo-Kaap was a mixed area. So there's a lot of nostalgia around what District 6 was and what District 6 represented. We don't need to go into that.
No, that's fine.
But they talk about various religions, various races that would live together. So Bo-Kaap was a district, as was District 6, which was also mixed race, mixed religion. And again, under apartheid, it became something completely different. It became a Malay area, and only Malay, according to the definition by Adi du Plessis, was Malay descent. You had to look a certain way and be Muslim, could own property in the Bo-Kaap. So apart from the city's interventions of new development that took place largely in the Kapini Street area, so I always find it very fascinating that tourists are taking they flock to Kapini Street when actually the older properties are on Dorp Street and further up and along Royal Street. But the tourists, I think the image of Bo-Kaap, I don't know if you've shown that, but the image of Bo-Kaap has become Kapini Street and colourful houses. The pressures facing Bo-Kaap now, I think, is that it is extremely well located. You're literally in the city centre, you're close to the mountains, you're close to the beach, and the pressures, there's two things, the development pressures and then also people moving into the area, people who can afford to move into the area. Right?
Yeah.
So it's gentrification and it's development pressure, which is being faced in, if you look at any other inner city area, it's Woodstock, it's Salt River, it's Walmer Estate. It's not just the Bo-Kaap that's facing these pressures. And the question that you asked earlier on, why do I have this interest in it? I'm studying it, I'm working on it. It is because there's this added layer of the spiritual, religious significance that is ascribed to this area that maybe is not ascribed to the other inner city areas. Okay. So the major, if you ask me, the major issues facing the Bo-Kaap now are those two issues. And that's what you see. I'm also fascinated at any point.
Yeah.
And I just challenge anybody to do this. If you Google the Bo-Kaap and news, some international journalist has picked up a story about Bo-Kaap. And they'll talk about gentrification. I don't know if you've seen that as well, but it's constantly in the news.
Yeah.
More so than other areas in Cape Town that face the same challenges. Yeah.
Absolutely. And also it becomes a place where very big ideas take place in the public realm, whether it's about experience in an actual place and also the rituals that take place. So, for example, in looking at community and culture, intangible cultural heritage is the practice of expressions, knowledge, and skills that communities and groups and sometimes individuals recognize as part of their cultural heritage. Now, the one thing about Bo-Kaap is that the side of intangible cultural heritage, even in the National Heritage Resources Act, is kind of not really looked at as a particular part in how people experience and also preserve culture. And in this particular community, for example, the role that religion plays, cultural practice, how does that shape the particular experience of the Bo-Kaap, even though it's within a particular westernized part of the city? What is this about this indigenous community that has its expression in culture where the intangible becomes important?
So what I'm thinking is, how does, in doing heritage impact assessments, how does significance affect what takes place? Right? So obviously, when you're doing a heritage impact assessment, you look at significance and you come up with indicators for what would be appropriate so that you don't affect heritage significance. But in the case of the Bo-Kaap is, how does the significance affect the management of this place? Because it's so, it's got, Bo-Kaap has the HPOZ, which is managed by the City of Cape Town. The buildings are, for most part, buildings in Bo-Kaap are older than 60 years. So there's that level of management by the provincial authority, and then we've got the national heritage sites, which are managed by SARA. So within the Bo-Kaap, the management of this place is already across all three tiers of government. Right? And then we have this added layer of the significance that's so deeply rooted in spiritual and religious. And I mean, the picture that you have up there, that happens during Ramadan. Is that one of the Ramadan?
It's on Wales Street. It's one of Ramadan. I think that's the Corner Cafe on Wales Street.
So those I'm going to use the word events, but those events is very public taking over the space in Wales Street was a response to an objection to development.
Yeah.
So even in itself, I think there's this conflating of what heritage is versus development.
Yeah.
And I don't know, that was not happening before there was an objection to development.
Yeah.
So the expression has been heightened. Now also it's been fed politically. I don't know. There's a lot more pictures where you see, I'm not going to mention the parties, but political parties being very present and visible. This was just before the election. If you recall.
I do.
So I think that expression of the intangible has also become heightened now that people are maybe misinterpreting the role of the Heritage Act in terms of preventing development. And I think this is, again, Bo-Kaap is a very interesting case because there is this huge development pressure and there is the significance. And so how does that sort of, and what is that, how does that translate to the authority saying we have to manage this place? We acknowledge the significance, but how do we manage this place?
So going back to even, I'm just thinking out loud now, going back to how you think about how heritage is kind of practiced and also experienced. It's not a static moment in time where we always want to preserve, and I think you used the word nostalgia earlier, but also there's a level by which these tensions will always be there, whether it's what do we do when we develop and preserve, whether it's a 60s, 70s kind of development by the city where it's state-driven, or whether it's community-driven around their needs, where basically you're saying, I want to preserve my culture and who I am. And also these definitions that I picked up weren't just kind of coming up for me. It's also part of how UNESCO defines the term cultural heritages, has changed content considerably in the recent decades, partially owing to the instruments developed by UNESCO. Cultural heritage does not end at monuments and collections of objects. It also includes traditions of living expressions inherited from our ancestors and passed on to our descendants, such as oral traditions, performance arts, social practice, rituals, festive events, knowledge and practices concerning nature and the universe, or the knowledge and the skills to produce traditional crafts. Now, this is a global understanding that's been under consensus in terms of what it is that you're looking at in terms of these definitions. And it goes on to say, while fragile, intangible cultural heritage is an important factor in maintaining cultural diversity in the face of growing globalization, where you could even say, for example, developmental pressures, and an understanding of the intangible cultural heritage of different communities helps with the intercultural dialogue and encourages mutual respect for other ways of life. We're going to go through now and look at a few examples where this takes place within the Bo-Kaap. So, for example, this is a street within the Bo-Kaap. It's called Kiapini Street, and This is after the renovations of some of the properties on the street, and then this is what's kept. Now, some people may argue this is how it's always, this is how it's going to be kept. However, as we know, over time, where the city need and or developmental intentions and also people having property rights within the area, these rights and also contestations happen throughout the life of the Boer Kaap. Hence, I said before that it's a very dynamic cultural landscape. One such example, and I'm just going to walk through everyone in terms of what it is that we're dealing with, is that there was SARA's job was to mediate between a dispute around heritage building that was proposed within the Boer Kaap limits, where basically the rights were given to the architect. The property developer had rights. However, there was a dispute. What ended up happening was that SARA was tasked with mediating between the rights of the community, the developers' rights, and also the community rights, and also the state authorities involved. What ended up happening was that everyone came around the table with the level of understanding that I'm just going to go through the slides very quickly. What became important was that basically, as you can see from the slides, it's an empty site off Batencraft, which is on the edge, which is a street on the edge of the city block, and it's a building that's inserted in between, and which is around very residential kind of side of the Boer Kaap. Now, there had to be a mediation between the scale and type of building that was proposed. What ended up happening, and I'm going through it very slowly, the approved drawings were basically is where the community objected to them, and the building height had to be addressed. Overall, this is the overall kind of street view, where the building line, if you look at the green building and the adjacent building to the site, which is the beige building, there was kind of an established height line. So by use of guidelines as well as the imperatives of both the development, we had to negotiate what the needs of the community are versus the needs of the development. These are just the pictures again, and as you can see on the top right side of the picture, you can see the minaret of the mosque, which is basically a call to prayer, as everyone knows, and you can hear it throughout. And this became an important point in terms of dealing with how the building would be set into the landscape. Over a couple of meetings, it was back and forth looking at the height and also looking at how the building itself sits within the landscape and the number of floors that were allowed in the development. Also, looking at buildings, it wasn't only looking at just the buildings adjacent to the site, it was also looking at the overall street view and also what kind of contribution the building makes to the greater context of the Boer Kaap. For example, that's how close the block that's being developed is to the city. So what also became important was that in terms of how we looked at the development, was the needs of development were about also looking at the accommodation of what they wanted to do on the site. However, what is generally not looked at was also how the building fits in terms of its roofscape and also how it sits within the broader city context. And the interesting part about this was, is it on the street, is it off the street? For example, due to its proximity to the mosque, how far does it sit on the pavement? What about traffic? All these things were issues that had to be debated and thought about in terms of what would be proposed further down the line. Again, just looking at issues of like how the Boer Kaap is very different, is looking at even the surfacing in terms of cobbled streets and how that talks about how you slow down traffic, and also the historical environment where most people back in the day didn't even own cars, therefore it was the cobbles weren't tarred, and that's kind of a remnant of how pedestrians were part and parcel of how the street was experienced. And this is the back of the site, where you can see, for example, just across the road, how high and the allowable kind of bulk that buildings from the city have as opposed to the Burgkaap. And these were part of the negotiations and consultations that were laid out on the table to say, what then, if you have these rights, do you put in the place of such a finer fabric kind of area? Through the process of design and everything else, there were iterations and looking at what kind of architecture that you would put in. And I'm just going to go through these very quickly. You've seen the kind of context. This is just the corner looking down from Wales Street, where both height and everything else became important. I'm just going to go just in the sake of time. But basically, what was finally decided on this was that the current proposal acknowledges the heritage significance and as well as the historic nature of the site. The view corridors were increased in previous approved scheme, and landscaped and courtyard between the two buildings. A dedicated off-street parking and loading area was also addressed. The street edge was activated where the public was more welcome. There are more issues around this, but I'm just using this as an example whereby in the end you ended up with, yes, a compromise where the community, the developer, and also with the aid of the project to move forward. We're not critiquing the architecture. We're not thinking about the issue of whether or not this is to this one. The idea that I'm interested in is that in terms of how communities now have engaged and are engaged in this particular community in what is put in front of them, and how heritage, because these plans and everything are light years before the actual project hits the ground. What has changed in the way that you practice in terms of where the community is made aware of these and the laws that protect that through consultation, for example? So if I propose a development, how am I made aware? And then also, what then is the role of the community, and what are the pitfalls, if there are any, in terms of where heritage, development, and community integrates? Thank you.
So I haven't seen the updated. I haven't seen this progress made on this particular application. But what I do know is that in 2007 there was it 2007, 2006?
Yeah.
There was an approved plan which didn't have the street interface. So sort of you go on site and there was a building on site. And that's the reason why I mentioned that in the timeline is because the process now, and it talks to your question, the process of consultation now would not have been in place in 2006, 2007. Right? So what you're ending up with now is a very different design or outcome, because you do have that level of consultation, that level of interaction, and SARD's involvement in this process. So what you would see happening now versus, which this is a very good example, versus what would have happened when, remember, the first HIAs in South Africa were done in the early 2000s. So we're not sitting with an industry that's been practicing for decades and decades and decades. It's a very new industry. We've got people coming in who are coming from various backgrounds. They come from planning, architecture, environmental, history, art. So also the practitioner that comes onto a particular project comes with a particular
bias.
Exactly.
Okay.
What this tells me is that if this application had been done now, it would have been done in the stages that we spoke about earlier on. So you would have your what is the significance and what are the indicators.
Yeah.
And that's a very key indicator in the walk-up, is to have active street edges.
Yeah.
Whereas the first design did not have that at all.
Yeah.
So now, to answer your question, how are people made aware of development applications? The Act actually calls for, so if we're just talking about the Heritage Impact Assessment, it says you do a Heritage Impact Assessment, you do your significance, your indicators, your design, your assessment, and then you take your report to consultation, which is not how we do it now.
Yeah.
So what we do is we do consultation at the start of the project. We go out and we say, this is what is coming. So we inform people of what is about to, what is being proposed, what is about to happen. And at that stage, the best thing to do is to not actually have a development proposal on the table. You just alerting that things has been identified, and that significance should be identified in consultation.
Yeah.
I don't know the significance of every area that I work in, so I rely on the local community to inform that significance. That then in turn informs the indicators, which would be, in a case like the walk-up, would be what would be appropriate for the street, for the context, for how it would affect the mosque, and then consultation again with the assessment phase. So the Act is not clear on at what point you do the consultation, but it is very important, I think, even at the stage of identifying significance, that there be consultation as well. I can't say how a practitioner is getting to a point of an assessment and then going out to consultation.
Okay.
I think that's highly problematic.
Okay.
And the role, your second, so it's twofold. It's one, understanding that the identification of significance is there to assist in making sure that it's management of change. It's not should something happen or not, it's how should it happen, so that it doesn't go back to the previous slide. Because
which one?
The one that showed all the developments. You had a slide about your 4 buildings. And not just related to this community, but any community. Understand that your involvement is not necessarily going to dictate whether or not something happens, because we are operating as you. The zoning scheme does allow for development rights over, somebody buying a particular parcel of land is buying it, having done their due diligence to see what they could possibly do on that side. So in terms of community involvement and the role of the community, there's a very important role in terms of identifying by significance, in terms of guiding the indicators. But what we've seen, and in Cape Town, has been a very huge development where there's been this objection to the development rather than how do we influence what the final design or product or development is, and how do we make that benefit? Because I don't think, if you look at that, there was a lot of speculation around, and there was a lot of allegations that the city of Cape Town was approving developments without the necessary permits. But as official, I'm not an official anymore, but as an official and as a pledge communities to say, when you see an application or proposed intervention, is to get involved, but not. I think that one in particular, the one in the top left corner, the block development, incited quite a lot of protests in the area. And it was more about public protest rather than getting involved in the process. I would say, though, that none of those, to me, I don't know if I can say this because I know we chatted about it earlier. Does this contribute to the significance of the area? No, it doesn't. Those buildings, as they stand now, they detract from the significance of the area, and I think they could have been better articulated. But in each of those, well, not the one on the top right corner, because that's the one you spoke about, but in each of those, there was a resistance to engagement. Yeah.
So in a way, those are kind of those led to the community being actively engaged in heritage resource management with the state, as well as state and actors outside. So it's an ongoing thing, and I think that's the one thing to kind of glean from the discussion is that heritage doesn't happen on its own; it happens in concert with other imperatives that also govern how we make cities, whether we as communities get involved or actors within the states and otherwise. Um, there has to be a way in which these issues are engaged with. For your time, and also, in a way, give an example of how Woke Up, also the lessons learned from Woke Up aren't just for now, they also form a part of how practice around these certain issues are not only particularly kind of special to South Africa, they actually engage with around the world. And as a result, there's a way in which, and this is the last slide in terms of best practice, where I'm just going to basically say the approach that is exercised in areas such as this one is the historic urban landscape approach, and which basically considers cultural diversity and creativity as a key assets for human, social, and economic development. It is an alternative method to cutting the city up through zoning into separate conservation areas, which thereby become ghettos or historic preservation. The approach addresses the policy, governance, management concerns involving a variety of stakeholders, including local, national, regional, international, public, and private actors in the urban development process. The approach based on the historic urban landscape implies the application of a range of traditional and innovative tools adapted to local contexts. These tools are civic managed engagement tools, financial tools. Capacity building is one of them, involving the main stakeholders, communities, decision makers, professionals, and managers in order to foster an understanding of the historic urban landscape approach and its implementation. Research, targeting the complex layering of urban settlements in order to identify values and understand their meaning for the communities and present them to, and also to encourage the use of information and communication technology to document, understand, and present complex layering of urban areas and their constituent components. The collection and analysis of this data is an essential part of the knowledge of urban areas to communicate with all sectors of society, and is particularly important to reach out to youth and all underrepresented groups in order to encourage their participation. I think these are the lessons that can be learned and also consolidated in the life of Woke Up. I think the project's not finished. However, I think in terms of the lessons learned, this would be a good way to end the discussion and follow up with questions and say, again, thank you very much for taking the time to see us. And and that's it from us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kobani.
The aesthetic values, historical values, which we there's the intangible. We need to look sides, various heritage community telling us how we communicate. Rituals need to be every side with this that happens. Done. So thank you for putting us in that issue where in the case of time, taking the two hands that are up, we have Cohen and Sibu. And please just note it down. Kobani will take the questions after.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. It was very, very interesting. Just one thing to note, and it's perhaps a kind of a catch-22 or an irony in a sense, but in order for those developments is much more engaged than they would have been before.
We just lost one person, but it's fine. We'll have to get it later. In terms of Kieran, yes, Kieran, thank you very much for that contribution. I think the one thing that Juanita would like, I think I'm going to flight that over to Juanita as a response. Thank you.
Community and heritage resource management. And both of us answered the same way. It's a lack of understanding of process. And I think even though, and I agree with the Kieran?
Yeah, it's Kieran.
That the development definitely sparks process.
Yeah.
So again, I think what is needed, helping communities articulate significance and what that means in terms of changes. And change, I mean development, I mean, whether it's the cobblestones, whether it's a building.
Yeah.
And particularly in the African context, the previous speaker,
Kim,
mentioned that we are dealing with more intangible significance in the African context, on the African continent, than a lot of what is dictated to us in Africa, as these are the processes that should be implemented. So I think there is an opportunity for us as practitioners in the African context to dictate how we can assist communities in articulating that significance and how that translates to process. But just sparking an interest that communities need to take.
And I'd like to thank everyone for Heritage webinar, and we look forward to seeing you next year. And should you have any questions and or questions, please send it in the chat and we'll answer as best we can. Thank you. Have a wonderful day, everyone, and goodbye. Thank you, Juanita.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Koba.
My colleague here, Natasha, and when the topic was suggested at first, she asked me a question and said, do you have a death wish? And I said, no, not at all. But I think that it speaks to the issue that I think I would like to talk about, and then maybe at the end we could try and see where we take it on this platform. So this is the outline of my presentation, beginning with the introduction, and then I'll just give a broad overview of SARA and this mandate very briefly. I won't touch on all the aspects. And then I will focus quite broadly on engaging communities, and that will assist both communities, but also those that have an interest in development. What are wake fees? Well, that's the amount of money paid by the developer to the affected community or communities, family for the processes of disturbance, alteration, exhumation, or relocation of a grave. And I think that this is a broad, but simplistic, really definition of what a work fees is, because ultimately it boils down to the money, and whether that money facilitates the processes of rituals that are associated with the process of alteration, exhumation, or relocation of a grave. There will be a monetary component attached to it. Well, this amount is largely dependent on negotiation. Whatever decision is reached will end up on SARA's table, or I think we then need to take an interest in this particular issue. I've just used a picture there to illustrate a complaint that arose, and it ended up on SARA's table, and SARA was sucked into resolve to try and see if a way forward could be found on that.
Well, work fears have been a thorny subject for various reasons. One, it touches on sensitivities of communities and individual families that are affected by grave relocation processes. So very important that once you say to people that we would like you to come and identify the grave, it evokes a lot of emotions for communities and families. If you look at a number of mining areas where this is taking place, it's taking place within the context of areas where there were forced removals. Very important. So times may spark fierce contestation between communities, families versus developers and applicants to a drawn-out process in terms of concluding that process. On one hand, some families may want this to be completed as soon as possible so that they are not exposed to this issue every time. On the other hand, developers this moving quickly, but conversely, it gives a little bit more detail as well. However, if you consider the NARA, the regulations, and the burial grounds and graves policy, none of this. I think I go back to the line of my contention that even if that's not the case, work fears have an impact on exhumation and relocation of graves in terms of Section 36. So I think I'll move on to this particular one, which is on engaging communities, because this is very, very important. I think it lays the foundation, heritage authorities, but also and applicants and developers out there. The first one, when you go to the Act in terms of the principles of heritage resources management, the process of identification and assessment and management of the heritage of the heritage resources of South Africa must take account of all relevant cultural values and indigenous knowledge systems. So very important. There are communities who perhaps at the beginning of the process may all be on board. And then during the process of engagement by this, and this case ended up in the Public Protector's Office. The pictures there, at least I hope you don't recognize some of the, fine if you do. There was the Public Protector's Office there, there was the CRL Rights Commission, and SARA was drawn in as well. Yes, the outcome, of course, the Public Protector ended up issuing the report and found that SARA had competently engaged with all parties involved to try and see whether this thing can move. And so number two, there's a complaint by another family in Mpumalanga, as I've given an example. They claimed 1 million per grave. Given how critical that mineral is, I will not mention that mineral because then people might search for it. But eventually, they were able to negotiate with that mine and reach a settlement of about 50,000 per grave. So you can see that the standards vary, and I mean depending on where you go. But in this case, the family has requested that they be given. I need to find the right term for it. Must exercise its neutrality and fiduciary. If SARA becomes the referee and the player, how will this pan out? Rights may vary from community to community and family to family. How do we frame that? What role can institutions such as the CRL Rights Commission play in finding middle ground for communities and developers and heritage specialists? I think the CRL Rights Commission has done this competently when they put out the framework for access to graves on private property for both individuals. Maybe there are things to take and learn from that. That's why we have them here to assist us with their presentation. Some communities have indicated that death cannot be quantified. Right? How do you quantify death and therefore the issue of exhumation and relocation? How do we resolve this issue? Threats of litigation will delay the issuing of permits because those need to be resolved. Communities and developers all come to SARA for a solution, and therefore we are in those sort of in the middle on this particular matter. This is my last slide, and then I will be done. I think those are the three very important points as I end. That one, community involvement is absolutely essential, and acknowledging the rights of the affected communities to be consulted and to participate in the process of exhumation and relocation is a critical pillar of the grave relocation process. And that graves encapsulate an important edifice of the country's memory and in the process of nation building. Therefore, taking into account all relevant cultural values and indigenous knowledge systems contributes to inclusive nation building. And that's the broader part of the sort of benefits when this is done particularly correctly. Lastly, reaching agreements with communities and individuals regarding the future of such a grave burial grounds contributes to fostering social cohesion, as communities that were previously denied their rights by the colonial and apartheid system can have their human remains reinterred with dignity. Sorry, that statement is incomplete. Yeah, so I think that is very, 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 very important, that we need to keep those in mind and in assisting us to perhaps engage with this particular issue. Steering a hornet's nest, yes, because it's a controversial issue, and it is something that is a problem for both communities, individuals, and also organizations. And yes, perhaps we then need to steer the hornet's nest to find an amicable solution that will then take us forward in the interest of.
They will say no. I understand what you're talking about, Mr. Madida. It's not easy. And also, as you said, with the referee and the player, unless there's a policy in place, the SARA terms, this is what we are saying, we cannot go beyond. Because of you, and I'm opening up for conversations, for questions and answers, because I feel like this is an element that we need to come to issue that has been for so long and so long. And when you protection unit, we're dealing with these cases. We were not consulted. They consulted the wrong family. Enough money. And the consent form. As much